Allies into enemies, imagining a Franco-Austrian war before the French Revolution. In his highly regarded work, The Origins of the French Revolutionary Wars, Tim Blanning argues that it was the Russo-Turkish War of 1787 which established the international system that would prevail during the French Revolution. True as this may be of the international system in general, in this paper I shall argue that the origins of the First Revolutionary War in particular, the Franco-Austrian War of 1792, can be dated as far back as 1783. At that moment, and in quick succession, three related crises over the Crimea, the opening of the Scheldt River, and the Bavarian Exchange made it increasingly evident that France and Austria, allies since 1756, were on a collision course. To be sure, it has long been acknowledged that the Franco-Austrian alliance had been weakened by the humiliating outcome of the 7 Years' War and the Polish partition of 1772, and that it was further strained by the three crises I just mentioned. But here I should like to go one step further. Not only, I shall argue, had France and Austria come to consider their alliance by 1785 as much a liability as it was an asset, but a considerable risk of war, which I believe historians have underestimated, had also risen between them. Although a Franco-Austrian war was avoided on this occasion, officials on both sides henceforth took this possibility seriously in their strategic planning, while the French public, which lived under the threat of war with Austria for nearly 6 months, became acclimated to viewing Austria as a clear and present danger with important consequences for the future. As I mentioned, the Franco-Austrian alliance of 1756 had suffered its stresses and strains by the 1780s, but neither side had seriously contemplated abandoning it, even its harshest critics, who contended that it should be made to work as designed, not jettisoned altogether. There were many reasons for this reluctance to abandon the alliance. The most powerful was the acknowledgement by the French that this would lead immediately to the resumption of the Austrian alliance with Britain, France's chief global rival, and by the Austrians that it would lead to the resumption of France's alliance with Prussia, Austria's nemesis since 1740. A second reason was the conviction that the alliance maintained peace on the continent between Europe's two major Catholic powers after 2.5 centuries of war between them, a peace that its two original sponsors, Louis XV and Maria Theresa, very much treasured. Third, there were the astonishingly strong sentimental ties between these two monarchs, who had sworn oaths of fidelity to one another and sought to perpetuate their alliance via multiple interdynastic marriages, most importantly the marriage of Marie-Antoinette to the future Louis XVI in 1770. All these considerations kept the alliance more or less intact so long as its original sponsors survived. But by 1780, both had passed from the scene, and neither of their successors was as committed to the alliance as they had been. Joseph II in particular had chafed under its constraints. Accordingly, within 6 months of Maria Theresa's death, Joseph sealed a new secret alliance with Russia, partly to break Catherine's alliance with Frederick the Great, which had frustrated his territorial ambitions in Bavaria and elsewhere, and partly to modulate Russian expansion, which posed a long-term threat to Austrian security. For the French, the chief question in all of this was whether the Austro-Russian alliance was compatible with the Franco-Austrian alliance, whose alleged purpose was the stabilization of Europe. The first answer came with the Crimean crisis of 1782-1783, about which I shall say relatively little. Although Catherine II had already seized considerable territory from the Turks after defeating them in 1774, she intended to take much more, and in that effort sought Joseph's help, especially in countering French efforts to block the dismantling of the Turkish Empire. At first, the French were relieved to find the Austrians joining their effort to pressure the Turks into making minor concessions to Catherine as a means for preventing worse. But in the spring of 1783, Catherine annexed the Crimea and surrounding territories and invited Joseph to take his own slice. Torn between caution and ambition, Joseph gambled on achieving both. In seeking more territory, his ambassador Marie-Antoinette told the French foreign minister Vergennes, Austria was seeking only parity with Russia. This was allegedly proved by their 1781 treaty, whose existence the Austrians confirmed for the first time, minus, that is, those clauses calling for their joint dismemberment of the Turkish Empire. Vergennes was shocked, not to learn of the existence of the treaty, which he had long suspected, but rather by its offensive purpose that Merci was vainly trying to conceal. Not only was the Turkish Empire at risk, Vergennes told Merci, but so was the Franco-Austrian alliance, whose dissolution threatened to set Europe ablaze as each power sought to compensate for the territorial gains of its rivals. To prevent this outcome, France assumed the role of mediator of the Crimean crisis, which Joseph hoped might enable him to make small territorial gains after spending huge sums to support Russia's acquisition of much greater ones. In the end, Joseph received nothing of the sort. What he got, instead, was a series of lectures from Vergennes, who pointed out that Austria, pursuant to its claim that its alliance with Russia was purely defensive, something that Vergennes no longer believed, had no right to anything. Hoisted by their own rhetorical petard, the Austrians were not surprisingly livid. Rather than suspecting Joseph of great territorial ambitions, France should be congratulating him on his restraint. Their alliance, Joseph wrote Marie-Antoinette in September, had now degenerated into mere words, compliments, and expressions, a view that the French were coming to share. For what they heard in Austria's prevarications was not only further confirmation of the existence and offensive purpose of the Austro-Russian alliance, but also the priority enjoyed in Austria's calculations over Austria's alliance with France. Joseph, as one French diplomat had put it in words Vergennes would soon echo, was, quote, sacrificing his alliance with the king to a monstrous alliance with Catherine, with the sordid intention of acquiring some sterile province. And, quote, the exclusive importance the Austrians placed on their bond with Russia, unquote, would lead to the dismemberment of the Turkish Empire. All this, he ominously warned, obliged the king, quote, to prepare to contain by force the indiscretions of Joseph II's character, which neither time nor experience will correct. Whatever force meant exactly in this context, a proposal for fighting a war with Austria had already been sketched out by Kaiser, Minister of the Navy. If Vergennes rejected it, it was not because he dissented from its justifying rationale. Nothing was more unstable than the Franco-Austrian alliance, Vergennes informed the French ambassador to Vienna in October, and the principal threat to it was the Russo-Austrian alliance, which was offensive in nature and which Joseph favored over its alliance with France. No, French restraint was dictated mainly by French exhaustion after the American War and to the fresher condition of the Austrian army, composed of 300,000 troops backed by Russia. Geography, as well as that asymmetry of force, meant France could lose on every front it chose to fight. Vergennes' caution notwithstanding, a turning point had been reached by the fall of 1783. France was now imagining a war with Austria that would have been unthinkable as little as 5 years earlier. As we shall now see, that war immediately came one step closer when Joseph, having acted, as he put it, like a, quote, valiant knight, unquote, in nobly refusing to join Catherine in stealing Turkish territory, tried to cash in on his valor by incorporating Bavaria into the Austrian domain. This project had been on the Austrian agenda for the most of the 18th century. In 1778, Austria had tried to snatch Bavaria, only to fail at getting most of it, thanks partly to Prussia's military intervention, but also to France's insistence that its alliance with Austria did not obligate it to underwrite Austrian aggression. So in 1782, Joseph got the bright idea of acquiring the parts of Bavaria that had eluded Austria by exchanging the Austrian Netherlands, essentially modern Belgium, for them, thereby avoiding the risks and costs of war and not offending France. Yet there was another consideration lurking behind this effort that has not attracted sufficient attention and bears on the argument I am making in this paper. France's long border with the Austrian Netherlands had always made the latter vulnerable to French attack. But so long as the Franco-Austrian alliance held firm, that prospect had seemed remote. Now, with the erosion of the alliance, a French attack no longer seemed unlikely, which called for new strategic thinking on Vienna's part, paralleling the new war planning in Versailles. If he exchanged the Austrian Netherlands for Bavaria, Joseph reasoned, he would greatly shrink the border he shared with France, thereby greatly reducing the vulnerability of his empire. This in turn would liberate him from, quote, my currently necessary considerations in regard to France and the maintenance of my alliance with it, unquote. In other words, the guiding premise of the Franco-Austrian alliance, that it would preserve peace, was slowly giving way to the recognition that it might dissolve into war. The complex mechanics of the Bavarian exchange wound up making this outcome ever more likely. To execute the exchange, Joseph had to persuade the current reigning prince in Bavaria and his heirs to accept the Austrian Netherlands in its place. For this reason, Joseph sought to boost the value of the Austrian Netherlands by opening the Scheldt River running through it, a river that had been closed to commercial traffic by the Treaty of Münster in 1648 to the great advantage of the neighboring Dutch merchants. Understandably, when Joseph insisted that he had a right to open the Scheldt, the Dutch fiercely objected. In late 1783 and 1784, negotiations between them broke down repeatedly, while public opinion in France and Europe generally swung firmly behind the Dutch, who were now seen as patriots valiantly protecting their historic rights in the face of attack by a despot. Frustrated in April and again in October, Joseph banked on a mild form of intimidation by sailing a ship up the Scheldt, only to have them fired upon by the Dutch, and in the second case, captured. Not surprisingly, all the Austrians were now indignant. Kaunitz, Joseph's chancellor, roundly denounced those fucking Dutch, those cheese merchants, whose attacks Austria construed not only as an insult to the emperor, but also as an act of war. Rather than pursue their conflict on the battlefield, however, the Austrians, like the Dutch, turned to France to mediate it. The French were in an awkward situation. By now, of course, they had little trust in Joseph's intentions, but they dared not alienate him if they wanted to leverage their role as honest broker to fashion a settlement favorable to their interests. As for the Dutch, although Louis XVI was genuinely offended by their attack on his brother-in-law's ships, France had been negotiating a treaty with the Dutch that would strip Britain of one of the most useful pivots of its power on the continent. France did not want to sacrifice its alliance with Austria to secure this new alliance with the Dutch. But in the end, clinching the latter became an overriding priority. Hence, on 14 October, less than a week after the second Dutch attack, Vergennes sent the king a memorandum in which, barring a much preferred diplomatic settlement, he proposed taking, quote, coercive measures to immobilize his brother-in-law's system of ambition, unquote. Vergennes remained doubtful that France could win a war with Austria, but he nonetheless envisaged deploying 3 armies of some 140,000 troops on France's eastern borders. In the meantime, he recommended the deployment of an army of observation on the French frontier with the Austrian Netherlands to make Joseph, quote, more receptive to the advice His Majesty might give him, unquote. Alas, Joseph had already formulated his own plan. Unless the Dutch accepted his latest peace proposals, he wrote Marie-Antoinette on 29 October, he would send an army of his own to the Dutch border, not, he emphasized, to wage a war of conquest, but to make the Dutch see reason as would any sovereign ruler in his place. In short, Joseph expected this latest show of force to be accepted for what he alleged it to be, namely an act of justice. The threat contained in this warning proved not to be idle. For upon the collapse of Austro-Dutch negotiations on 31 October, he ordered 80,000 Austrian troops to march to the Dutch border. In response, the Dutch, following established practice, opened their dikes, flooding parts of their territory and parts of the adjoining Austrian Netherlands. Now, if Joseph truly expected the mobilization of his army to be seen as an act of justice in France, he was sadly mistaken. While periodicals like the Gazette de l'Aide tarred the deployment as a, quote, sort of war declaration, unquote, the French in general, Bercy reported to Joseph, believed, quote, the intention of your majesty is nothing less than to destroy the Dutch Netherlands while appropriating those provinces most suitable for commerce, unquote. On 1 November, an emergency meeting of the Royal Council convened to discuss the crisis. While still opining for a diplomatic solution, Vergennes and the council were unanimous in recommending forward action against an emperor whose recklessness threatened France's security perimeter and the entire international order. Quote, if the title that assures the closure of the Scheldt to the Dutch is null and void, unquote, Vergennes intoned, quote, that which assures Alsace to France is no longer valid, unquote. France could not afford again to become the, quote, the instrument of Austrian ambition, unquote. As Vergennes had anticipated, the king was soon won over. Madam, he reportedly told Marie-Antoinette, because the emperor, your brother, is forcing me to put on my war pants, I declare to you that I will not take them off as soon as he might like, unquote. On September 17th, a declaration was sent to Joseph informing him that the king, quote, could not be indifferent to the fate of the Dutch Netherlands and watch its rights and possessions attacked with open force, unquote. For this reason, he was now authorizing the deployment of troops to the French border with the Austrian Netherlands, and that, in fact, meant that one army would be soon approaching another. Not surprisingly, the Austrians were stunned by the declaration, which Joseph first dismissed as a joke to which he would not respond directly, and then denounced as no less than a, quote, sort of declaration of war, unquote. Mercy found it, quote, so disloyal, so shocking, so offensive, that he swore it could have been drafted by the Prussians. But rather than give full vent to his anger, Joseph decided to inject into this explosive mix the project that had motivated him in the first place, and namely the Bavarian exchange, which he had kept under tight wraps until now. Convinced that a war crisis was a terrible thing to waste, he and Mercy laid out a careful strategy, not only to convince the French that the exchange was the last best peaceful solution to the Dutch imbroglio, but also to sponsor it in their capacity as mediators. Meanwhile, however, and this part of the plan historians have overlooked, the threat of war, far from being shortened, had to be prolonged to allow the French enough time to mull it over, and far from being eased, had to be inflated to frighten them into advocating it. Quote, several weeks of delay, Mercy pointed out, quote, will allow the fear of war to ripen, and that is all to the better. Should people believe there are other Pacific expedients that could replace the Bavarian exchange, it would be more difficult to achieve. Joseph replied, if, as you observe very well, one made this exchange appear to France as the only way to avoid war, France could possibly support it. To obtain that result, it is necessary to raise the imminent danger of war and the beginning of hostilities. Now, if there was any aspect of this extraordinarily dangerous plan about which the Austrians need not have worried, it was that the French were insufficiently alarmed by the threat of war. All the memoranda submitted by the king's ministers on the subject evoked its prospect and advocated stern countermeasures. To do less, Salon warned, risked not only losing a new ally and standing in the eyes of Europe, but also increasing the chances of French entanglement in a wider European conflict. Quote, in the belief that we had avoided a conflict that was not to be feared, we would throw ourselves into a long and ruinous war, unquote. On this logic, ratcheting up the threat of war was the only way of avoiding it. Beginning in October, war fever also gripped the general public, which strongly favored French intervention on the Dutch side. The general opinion, reported the Saxon Chargé d'Affaires on 3 December, quote, is now that war is inevitable. Although the public foresees how onerous will be to the nation, the unanimous wish is that without delay, the king prepared to arrest the ambitious projects of the emperor and to provide efficacious aid to Holland, unquote. Each turn in Franco-Austrian diplomacy may have alternately raised and lowered public fears, but war appeared to be, quote, absolutely inevitable as late as February 1785. In pondering the situation, some recalled the Austrian devastation of Alsace during the War of the Austrian Succession, and based on that experience, thought it would be prudent for France to fortify its cities on its eastern frontier. Informed public opinion also kept track of French war preparations. These included the dispatch of the Comte de Maillebois as Captain General of the Dutch Army, the selection of the Prince de Condé and the Duc de Broglie as commanders of the French armies in Flanders and Alsace respectively, and the stockpiling of war material along the French border. After a flurry of diplomatic activity that raised hopes for a diplomatic settlement in December, war clouds began gathering again in February, and only in March did they begin to dissipate. That they lasted so long can in large part be attributed to Joseph's policy of deliberate intimidation to force the French into underwriting the Bavarian exchange. I am continuing my military dispositions, Joseph wrote Catherine on 13 December, and my troops are marching in full swing towards the Netherlands with everything they need. Informed public opinion could grasp the strategy and bemoaned its possible consequences. The eventual succession of Bavaria, noted one newsletter on 28 January, quote, is the principal source of fears that the Scheldt affair is the harbinger of a general conflagration as well as the pretext for war preparations with far greater objectives. By this time, however, it was becoming clear to Joseph that his Bavarian exchange plan was doomed. For one thing, possibly due to French connivance, the reigning house of Bavaria refused to accept it. For another, partly due to Vergennes' nibble politicking, the French refused to sanction it as well. Although to overcome the king's reservation, Vergennes initially spoke mildly in its favor, his first memorandum on the exchange ended on a cautionary note, stressing that it could not be adopted purely and simply because it bore on conditions gravely affecting France and the empire. These cautions reappeared in a final council resolution of 1 December, which, while conceding that the exchange did not apparently contravene the king's interests, contained the poison pills that would eventually kill it, namely the requirement that the empire authorize the exchange and that the king of Prussia not oppose it. In a letter to Joseph on 2 December, drafted no doubt by Vergennes, the king set the price for French consent to the exchange at the reduction of Austrian demands on the Dutch, and by way of paying Joseph the compliment of taking his war threats seriously, enjoined him to suspend the march of his troops toward the Netherlands. Finally, in a fresh round of memos composed in early January, Royal Council members opposed the exchange on a variety of political and strategic grounds, including the argument, reminiscent of Joseph's, that transference of the Austrian Netherlands out of the emperor's domain would deprive France of the opportunity to attack Austria on its most vulnerable flank. There is no time left to track the laborious process whereby Joseph, having dropped the Bavarian exchange and his demand for opening the Scheldt, squeezed from the Dutch and the French as much money as he could in payment for his rights over Maastricht. Once it was clear that such auctioneering, not the Bavarian exchange, would provide an exit from the crisis, the threat of war did recede and the French and Austrian armies gradually withdrew, although Joseph continued to use his to intimidate the Dutch for months. They, in turn, mocked his monetary demands as, quote, the emperor's tip, and represented him much like the cheese merchants that he had taken them to be. These pleasantries and the failure of war to erupt at this time have given excellent historians like Derek Beals and Monroe Price grounds for characterizing the Dutch crisis as, quote, a diplomatic farce and, quote, a diplomatic comedy. In concluding this paper, I should like to suggest that these labels capture only part of the story. First, although neither the French nor the Austrians wanted war and genuinely sought to avoid it, they were not so risk-averse as to rule out its possibility in order to gain their objectives. The risks they took might seem small to us now, but they did not seem so small to them. Indeed, both sides explicitly acknowledged how a skirmish between the two approaching armies might ignite an unwanted conflagration. Moreover, as we have learned from Christopher Clark's masterful Sleepwalkers, how Europe went to war in 1914, how easily leaders can take their nations into wars they neither wanted nor anticipated. And it is not inconceivable that some toward event, say Joseph Sudden's death and his replacement by his more bellicose brother, Leopold, might have sparked a war at this time, just as an assassination in Sarajevo sparked a war a century ago. Second, it is worth reiterating how aware the public was of the possibility of war with Austria and the many months the entire nation lived in its shadow. No doubt only a minority at this time recalled Austria's last invasion of France. But the Dutch crisis, following hard on the Crimean crisis, forced leaders to plan for a renewal of such a conflict and provided a new generation with a foretaste of the war to come in 1792. These crises also enhanced the suspicions that would fuel the next war, including the widely spread libel that the millions eventually paid to Joseph by the French government to settle the crisis, owed to a diversion of funds by Marie-Antoinette, who was seeking to bankrupt France. Of course, in the long arc spanning the life of the Franco-Austrian alliance, these were only 2 points of inflection. But they were key moments when the French confirmed that Austria had sealed an alliance with Russia, that its purpose was offensive, that Austria was willing to sacrifice the French alliance to maintain it, and that a war with Austria was by no means beyond the horizon of possibility. Thank you all very much for your attention.